The U.S. Supreme Court ended its session with fireworks last week. Major cases heard and settled. Key decisions on whether federal taxpayers should clear voluntarily assumed debt by citizens who decided to obtain higher education instead of working. Another case involved racism and preferences to who can actually attend which college based on color of skin instead of the merits of academic achievement in high school. And a third had to do with the First Amendment and the American dream of, working for yourself, and whether or not private businesses must toe the line on government messaging or demands if they want to keep their doors open and serve the public. So who can or must private companies, mom and pop businesses, work with or for? The decision has ramifications all the way to your favorite independent corner shop. And joining us is Randall Wenger. He is the chief counsel for the Independence Law Center. Good evening, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Now, most recently, people may be familiar with your name or work regionally here in Baltimore due to an op-ed that appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer on Thursday. But most importantly, nationally or historically, it was a brief that you wrote on behalf of the Independence Law Center for a major Supreme Court case for business owners like Lori Smith and her 303 Creative Company versus Elemis. What is the Independent Law Center, and what was your role in this groundbreaking case?
We're a civil rights pro bono law center in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and we care a lot about maintaining those freedoms that have made America great and free. And so we were asked to write a friend of the court brief for this case and talked a little bit about the Test Acts, which I am sure that probably 0.5% of listeners have ever heard of. But English Parliament back in the 1600s made people take oaths if they were going to be involved in certain professions. And those oaths actually then excluded a whole group of people, Roman Catholics in particular, who were then no longer able to engage in certain professions. And so when I thought about this particular case, are we going to just do the same thing over again by excluding people who can't, because of their conscience, speak certain messages? Are we just going to push them out of the marketplace? Or are we going to create a more inclusive environment by recognizing, hey, this is America, we've got all kinds of diversity of beliefs. Let's just keep with our American tradition of giving a lot of space for people to be who they are, to respect that, and not force people to speak messages they disagree with.
Yeah, I find it ironic that we're trying to distance ourselves from a 1600s law of British Parliament again in the United States now. And when we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's the big buzzword in corporate America. That's what the government wants you to believe in. But when a business owner tries to do their own thing, it's verboten for some reason.
I think what we need to remember is just these American traditions that have made America great. And so if we look at some of these issues, like what was going on in 303, and Lori Smith, who runs a website business and wanted to get into the marriage website business, promoting traditional marriage because she believes in traditional marriage, but not same-sex marriage. And if we look at some of those issues that are hot-button issues today, and think about what the hot-button issues were in our past, in our Anglo-American history, religion was contentious, but we figured out our way through that. We figured out our way through that not by insisting that everybody agree, and not by canceling differences, but allowing a diversity of belief that creates an open and free environment for everyone. And if we actually turn up the volume on our fundamental rights, our right to freedom of speech, our right to free exercise of religion, that will actually help us to be able to have that kind of environment where we can show respect for everyone. We don't get there by creating the contention that says, hey, there's only one way to believe in these issues, and if you don't, we're going to completely push you out of the marketplace.
Yeah, and your op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer was very much on spot with that and explained the British law as well. I'll tweet it out at Kevin Battle. In extreme examples of what you're talking about for Lori Smith, would that be akin to like a home builder that won't build an addition on a home for somebody that's a pornographer, knowing that they may use that for sex trafficking, or a vegan restaurant won't cave into the demands of a customer who's very hungry and wants a steak that night?
Well, some of these examples, like if And I've heard the idea of the Jewish deli that's being asked to provide a ham sandwich. Let's be clear: if it's not on the menu, if it's not something that you do, nobody's even envisioning that those things are implicated. But yet we somehow are expecting that then of others to say, we don't care what your belief system is. You just have to get on the program here. And that really ought not be the way that it is. And so there's two values that we're trying to hold simultaneously, and we can. And the one value is respect for everybody. Let's respect everybody and get along. And the other is freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of belief. And so the Supreme Court last week was very clear that we can do both simultaneously. We don't have to give up our ability to believe things and speak consistent with those beliefs, or choose not to speak consistent with those beliefs, in order to respect everyone. So it's one thing to say, Laurie Smith, you have to design a website for something you disagree with, and it's another thing if Laurie Smith were to refuse to serve a gay customer who wants a website that talking about her new business. And so the Supreme Court wasn't saying, hey, you've got the right to discriminate against people because they're gay or lesbian, or because of their religion, or because of their race, or any of those factors. Those things don't change. The court was just very clear that we shouldn't view forced speech in the same paradigm. We don't have to force people to speak in order to create an environment that's respectful for everyone. And in fact, that's the very thing that shows the disrespect for groups of people.
We're speaking to Randall Wenger. He's the chief counsel for the Independence Law Center regarding the latest U.S. Supreme Court ruling for business owners. One will notice a great deal of angst from some media outlets over this decision. I believe it's a logical decision. It allows for the independent to remain independent, but I see how some fear it could lead to discrimination. So those, and you mentioned that, so those who are upset with the Supreme Court ruling, how can you allay their fears and let them know that this decision is actually beneficial to all, regardless of opinion on the core of the particular case's topic?
Yeah, I'd encourage people to actually read the opinion. It's readable and it's understandable, and I think for some people, if we begin to reverse the polarity on some of the examples, people will go, "Oh yeah, fundamental rights, they serve us all." And so we understand that generally with freedom of speech, right? Where we say, "Yeah, I don't really agree with what that guy over there is saying, but if I take away his right to speak, that means I don't have my right to speak anymore, and I want my right to speak. So, okay, let's make this work." But if we get into the opinion and read some of the examples, they were interesting because Justice Gorsuch was saying, well, look, just because a protected class can be sort of implicated on the outside doesn't mean you have to do everything that's requested. If your business is to speak, you don't have to carry a message that you disagree with. And then he used a few interesting examples. One was a Muslim movie maker should not have to make a movie that's promoting Zionism, right? And, the same would be true for should a gay or lesbian person have to design a website that's celebrating the decision of 303 Creative, or that's saying traditional marriage is the only form of marriage. Like, we get that, whether it's a speechwriter. There's some municipalities, some states, including the District of Columbia, where ironically, you're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of political party. And yet, can you imagine a speechwriter being forced to write speeches for Donald Trump if they're a liberal? Like that's just nonsense. And so if we want to create space for us to all follow our conscience, whether it's from the left or whether it's from the right, whether we're progressives or conservatives, we give wide latitude for people to just be able to say no. And this is not a new proposition, and it goes back to the First Amendment. But one of my very favorite cases to quote is West Virginia versus Burnett. It's a case that arose out of Jehovah's Witness kids not wanting to salute the flag at the beginning of the school day, and they were kicked out of school. And the Supreme Court made it very clear that the goal isn't to create uniformity of beliefs. And trying to create uniformity of beliefs only gets us closer to the graveyard of society. And they were looking, this is in the midst of World War II, and so they were looking at societies that were trying to create uniformity of belief, and that didn't work well. And they said it's better in America if we allow people to be who they are rather than forcing any kind of orthodoxy. That protects freedom of speech. That protects freedom of religion. It protects a society that's going to give space for everyone. And so then when I'm thinking about listeners who may be concerned about this decision because of things that they've read other than the opinion itself, I would say there are a lot of people who are actually fomenting discrimination through this opinion by talking wrongly about this opinion. If they're spreading a false narrative that this is targeting the gay community because people just hate gays, well, don't believe the narrative. It's those who are fomenting that kind of speech that really are creating the divisive, hateful environment, not the court's opinion that's just saying, hey, let's give space for everybody to be who they are and hold fast to this American principle that helps us on both sides, that government should never be able to commandeer our speech.
Yeah, and Lori Smith of the 303 Creative, did she seek the fight due to how a particular law was written in her community, or was there a particular issue that sparked her involvement, like the baker sued for not making the particular cake?
Sure, and that's been some of the false narrative in this case, where people are saying, oh, there was really no controversy at all. But there is somebody who approached her to do a same-sex marriage website, and she wanted to be able to just promote traditional marriage. So she brought what's called a pre-enforcement challenge. That's something that happens all the time on civil rights work, where you don't have to wait until you're being prosecuted and fined by the government before you can assert your civil rights. You can go in on the front end and say, the way that you state are interpreting this law, I think I'm going to get into trouble. And so she thought she would get into trouble because she was watching what was happening to Jack Phillips, the cake baker. She lives in the same state as Jack Phillips. So she brought this pre-enforcement challenge, and interestingly, the state of Colorado said, yes, we would prosecute you. This really is a case in a controversy. There's nothing abstract about this. The only way that she can do what she wants to do and speak only what she wants to speak is because last week she got a decision in her favor from the Supreme Court.
And why do these cases, both of them, probably more, come out of Colorado instead of other states? What's happening in Colorado?
Well, Colorado is not the most conservative of states. I mean, you may think back 20 years ago and think of the conservatism that would come from Western states and freedom and that sort of thing. Colorado is, with the growth of Denver, it's a very progressive state at this point, and so their particular human relations commission out there that oversees issues of discrimination is extremely aggressive. So it's not any surprise at all that both of these cases would come out of Colorado.
Yeah, when I was young, I remember many businesses would have signs on the wall or near the register that said, "We reserve the right to refuse service for whatever." You do not see those signs anymore. Is it just because businesses want to be more welcoming, or is it because of this case or the Colorado laws that bar businesses from being a little more choosy in who they contract work with?
Well, I don't know the laws of every state, but I'm assuming that they're similar to Pennsylvania's, where I'm based. And the law prohibits you from saying, we don't serve certain protected classes. And that's good. Like that's something that we want, where we're not pushing people away because of who they are, because of a class that they belong to. And yet we should, as Americans, be able to understand clear distinctions between saying no to a person based on who they are and saying no based on a message that we don't agree with and that we don't want to support.
So we're a big tent, all are welcome, but we just don't want the government forcing business owners to provide services that those business owners disagree with because they disagree with the messaging that the government wants.
Well, right. And so this case in particular was a speech case. This was dealing with creative professionals who are engaged specifically in the service of speech. They're being paid for what they say. And so you can see that very clearly if it would, in this case, it was a website designer, but it could be anything from, a speech writer to somebody who's being asked to create murals or movies or anything of that sort. And then the question is going to become, the next question down the road is, what all constitutes speech? And that's where someone like Jack Phillips, the cake baker, I think we're going to get to the point where we're recognizing that, yes, that too is speech, particularly when people are asking for certain messages. So Jack Phillips, after his trip up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court slapped down the state of Colorado because of the way that they were just so harshly targeting him based on his beliefs, somebody once again asked him for a cake, and this time it was a cake to celebrate gender transition, and a cake that was specifically designed to communicate gender transition. And of course, he just had to say no. Like, he works with everybody. He just doesn't want to do every message.
So 303 Creative versus Elemis is final. The law of the land, can it be undone or reheard?
It is done. At the same time, our fundamental rights only last as long as we're vigilant to protect our fundamental rights. And, folks have died for the freedoms in our country. And, from the perspective of the courts, people litigate cases for the freedom in our country. And so there will be more cases in order to remain vigilant, because there are forces in both directions here. Those who really are trying to foment disagreement and hatred over these issues. And so I think the cases will be back, just because there are some who say the only way to do this, to show respect, to avoid discrimination, is everybody has to speak these messages. But that's not the American way to be able to get to unity and diversity and inclusion. Instead, that only creates dissent and discrimination.
A very interesting and educational conversation. Thank you very much. I appreciate the education. Randall Wanger, Chief Counsel for the Independence Law Center. Thank you very much for joining us here on WCBM, sir. Have a good evening.
Thank you for having me.